Have we outgrown religion? Are we finally free from the shackles of dogma? Or are these shackles more akin to life preservers? In this video, I'm going to explore the basic question, do we need Christ? This is part 2 of the series. In part 1, I laid out the difference between the idea of something and the actual something. You can check it out in one of these spaces. I never know which one. In this video, we'll explore the characteristics of necessity and their implications. So let's dive in. First, let's define necessity. It seems like a basic concept, but you'd be surprised at how murky it can get. Necessity has 3 characteristics. One part is the subject. That would be the necessity itself. The other is the object, so what that necessity is necessary towards. And the third is the condition which the necessity affords. For example, when we say a plant needs water to survive, the water would be the necessity. The plant would be that which needs the necessity, and survival would be the condition which that necessity affords. And so when we have all 3 points clearly defined, we can understand what constitutes a necessity. Furthermore, what this implies is that without water, plants cannot survive, which means that if we see a plant and the plant is alive, this must mean that water exists or existed in that area. Here's another example. Large groups of people need laws to peacefully coexist. This claim says that in order for large groups of people to coexist for a prolonged period of time, written laws have to be established. Laws being rules which, if broken, have some form of consequence. This would necessitate that if we see a large group of people who have been coexisting for a prolonged period of time, they must have an established law. If we were to stumble upon a large group of people coexisting that did not have an established law, then an established law would not be necessary for large groups of people to coexist. And here the prolonged period of time I think is necessary because technically a lion and a zebra coexist peacefully, but only for a small amount of time. Eventually the lion's existence becomes problematic for the zebra. The crucial thing is that something needing something else is an indicator of this something else existing. If we see a plant that's alive, then water must exist. If we see a large society, then law must exist. Now, it's true that we don't need to understand the mechanisms of how a plant works in order to know that water exists. We can simply just look at water. Likewise, we don't need to do a deep dive into civilizations to know that the law exists. We can just simply commit a crime and see what happens. However, there are instances in which existence was derived not from physical evidence, but purely from the principle of necessity. For example, all living cells have lots of water molecules within their membranes. However, their membranes have a hydrophobic structure, which means that only tiny water molecules with no charge can cross through them, which is not enough water to justify the amount inside the cells. So there had to be a mechanism by which water could enter the cell by necessity. Furthermore, scientists knew that most hydrophilic molecules, those would be molecules that are not hydrophobic, enter and leave the cell through proteins. And so they derived, through necessity, that there had to be a protein which was responsible for the transfer of water molecules. Sure enough, scientists later discovered aquaporin, the protein responsible for the osmosis of large quantities of water molecules. Likewise, Einstein predicted many astrological events, but he didn't do this in a prophetic way. He simply observed reality and noticed that it needed certain conditions in order for it to exist the way it exists. Even though he never saw these conditions and was even unconvinced of them because of how radical they were, he was still correct in their prediction. The reason why he was so unconvinced is because they went against our intuitions, and they also seemed to go against Newtonian physics, and yet he was correct. So we've established what the principle of necessity is and what its characteristics are, and how this principle can lead to the assumption of something's existence without its physical evidence. Now, when it comes to God, there's lots of different arguments for his existence based on necessity. There's the ontological argument, the argument for motion, the fine-tuning argument, the design argument, etc. But what this video will try to do is explore an existential argument. When it comes to raw existentialism, it is not entirely possible to make a clear syllogism with logic and reason, but through observational exercises, we can hopefully arrive at some kind of answer. So let's begin. To ask whether or not we need God, we need to ask what kind of being we are. To do this, we put ourselves first in the context of what's around us, and second in the context of how we perceive ourselves and others. As we know, we are human animals. We are a kind of ape that is not like other apes in that we can reason. Our cognitive abilities allow us to have something we call self-awareness. This self-awareness poses a question. Who is aware of who? If you think about it, to be aware of something, there has to be two parties involved. That which is aware and that which the awareness recognizes. To be self-aware creates a circle of awareness. In other words, to behold something necessitates something to behold and someone to do the beholding, which creates a beholding circle. We can prove this with a thought experiment. Right now, you are aware of yourself, but you're also aware that you're aware of yourself, which means that you're aware that you're aware that you're aware of yourself, which in turn means that you're aware that you're aware that you're aware that you're aware of yourself, and so on and so forth. So the question then is, who is aware of who? You'll often hear people say, control yourself or be yourself. Well, who is controlling who? Am I, myself, controlling again myself? How is this possible? There is a relation going on. Whether we see the self as an idea or an illusion or as ourselves, we still interact with that, which means that we have a relation with it. Now the question then is, if the self is an idea, what is that idea based on? Furthermore, when one is unhappy with themselves, which let's face it, many of us are, what part of themselves are they unhappy with and why? Well, in order to be unhappy about a part of yourself, you must have a better idea of what you want that part of yourself to be. The French philosopher René Girard posits that this is due to something called mimetic theory or mimesis, meaning that you hold certain people in your life in high esteem and want what they have, and even want what they want. When this mimesis is established, the model of your desires eventually becomes your rival. Over time, this process intensifies. When I desire what you desire, your desire intensifies as a result. This creates mimetic rivalry, a feedback loop of escalating conflict, because the more alike we become in desire, the more we come into conflict. As mimetic desire grows, it spreads into the collective. As it spreads into the collective, the model becomes less attainable. In other words, the more people imitate the same model, the more valuable that model seems. The more valuable it seems, the more difficult it is to obtain. This intensifies desire and breeds competition. And this competition sharpens to the point where people compete for an identity. This makes sense. Everything we don't like about ourselves signifies that we want to be like someone else. And other people want to be like that someone else too, to the point where they want to have someone else's identity, which in turn means that multiple people are competing for the same identity. So the object of the desire becomes secondary, to the point where what matters is not the thing in itself, but that someone else wants it. Eventually, this cycle grows into an uncontrollable crisis, what Girard calls the sacrificial crisis. Norms break down, roles lose authority, and taboos are violated. The distinctions that hold society together begin to disintegrate, to the point where all against all becomes the foreseeable future. And now enter the scapegoat mechanism. When society is on the brink of collapse, it comes together and unites in blame against a single individual or group, often marginalized, different, or ambiguous. The violence is then redirected to the scapegoat, whose death or expulsion temporarily restores peace. We can see examples of this all throughout history. The fires in Rome, which Nero blamed on the Christians. We can see mimetic desire for survival, purity, and religious meaning in suffering between the Romans and the Jews. The Salem witch trials, people desired moral purity, divine protection, and social standing, and the women were scapegoated. In the French Revolution, it was the monarchy and the aristocrats that were the scapegoat. And in Nazi Germany, the Jewish people were the scapegoats. We also see examples of this in the Red Scare, the partition of India, and the Bosnian War. This mechanism is absolutely everywhere, and it all stems from desire. And so we can establish with a fair amount of confidence that wherever there is a scapegoat, followed by relative peace, mimetic rivalry was on the brink of its arson, which means that a scapegoat is a necessary antidote to mimetic rivalry. Here is where God comes in. Christ is both the perfect model and the perfect scapegoat. If one models their life after Christ, mimetic rivalry is subverted, because he invites imitation that does not seek rivalry, status, or possession, but radical self-giving. This not only cures the dissonance of the self, but also extinguishes the violence and the rivalry that comes with our mimetic nature. Furthermore, his execution displayed the absolute horror of a scapegoat mechanism. A man who did not sin received the worst possible punishment, exposing the heinous and demented reality of the scapegoat cycle. Therefore, when it comes to Christ at least, he is necessary to extinguish the relentless flame of mimetic rivalry. We can thus, with confidence, say that Christ and the relation to Christ, that is, relating the self to him, is necessary both through and against the scapegoat mechanism, which means that he is necessary for society which means that he is necessary for every member of that society. So our synthesis goes as follows. People today need to imitate Jesus of Nazareth in order to overcome their rivalry, which otherwise leads to a cycle of violence. Now, you might ask yourself whether you could imitate other people as a replacement. But in our history, Christ is the only figure who both fully exposes and transcends this mechanism. He's the only figure who embodies this antidote perfectly. In order to act like Christ, we need a Christ figure to anchor that idea of what we ought to be like in order to end the cycle of violence. In other words, in order to mimic Christ, we need Christ himself. This is where things begin to take on a new angle. Christ did not only teach us earthly behaviors, he taught us to worship God above all else. The religious aspect of his teachings is ingrained deeply with what he came here to say, making the extraction of values from the rest of his rhetoric impossible, as it would disintegrate what he came to do and say. Therefore, the religious aspect to his teachings are necessary to the antidote against mimetic rivalry which he offers. Therefore, Christ, as teacher and as God, is necessary for the abolition of the cycle of mimetic rivalry. This is just one dimension of how God can be a necessary being from a phenomenological perspective. Now you might be thinking, well, there certainly are other ways to disrupt this cycle. And on the outset, you might be right. But the ways which work are those which are selfless, those which strive for the love of thy neighbor. In other words, they're still Christian ways. Though we are used to hearing the teachings of Christ today, it's useful to know that his claims were revolutionary and radical in his time. His parables broke theological and philosophical dispositions and revealed a higher standard for what it means to be a person, making him an indispensable figure for our contemporary ethical structures. This is Logos and Mythos. Thank you for watching.